With you.
God with you.
Let's pray. We're grateful for the gift of the past, of faithful people who help shepherd the church into the future. We pray a blessing on our time together as we consider their lives and their witness. In Jesus' name.
Amen.
All right, so we're going to do the first 3 centuries of the church in like 2 45-minute segments. Cram a lot in a very short amount of time. Hopefully it'll make sense. The place to start is with the Jerusalem church. And I think we don't consider how remarkable it is that the church survived, right? It began in a tiny backwater country that was occupied by the Romans, that gave the Romans all kinds of trouble. It eventually was destroyed by the Romans because of the rebellion. It was started by peasants, by fishermen, by a crucified rabbi. They like saying, in a sense, any executed criminal in our system was God, and was the Messiah, which is ridiculous. And nobody in their right mind would follow such a thing. And yet, in a very short time, this Christian movement took over the world. It began in Jerusalem. If it had stayed in Jerusalem, we wouldn't be talking much about it. It would be like all the other sects that began in Jerusalem that are gone up. You don't need any Sadducees anymore. Not around. Pharisees, they may be the present-day rabbis. You don't see any of the Essenes, those are the people in the desert. They're gone. Zealots. Well, maybe we still have zealots in Jerusalem. I guess they do, don't we? But the Jerusalem church. So it began on the day of Pentecost. As far as we can tell, about 33 AD, something happened. This is the Festival of the Booths, where all the people come into Jerusalem for this big festival, and the Spirit blows through the people. The faith had a distinctly Jewish character in the beginning. It was never intended to be anything to reach out to the Gentiles. That's why the faith struggled so much with what do you do with Gentiles? Do they have to become Jews first, or can they just become Christians? So in the beginning, there was no thought whatsoever about reaching out beyond the borders of Judaism. They may have gone out beyond Jerusalem, but they were not interested in going beyond Judaism. It was a communal life. We read that in the book of Acts, where they donated all their stuff to a collective, and then they distributed to anybody who had need. We have all the stories in the book of Acts, including the one of Ananias and Sapphira, who don't give it all and are struck down dead. We have the Acts 2:42, where they meet together in their homes. Well, the reason they did that is because they expected Jesus to return immediately. There was no sense that they were going to be around for very long at all. In fact, Jesus told them, 1 generation shall see my return. So the expectation was Jesus is returning right away. Therefore, we're going to live in this communal life. We are going to contribute to the needs of the poor. We're going to wait. And Jesus will come back. The new kingdom will be ushered in. The Jewish understanding of that new kingdom was a kingdom on earth. They were not thinking like we do about this heavenly kingdom that eventually will take over. They, at this point, thought Jesus is coming back and will rule. The Romans will be put down. From this small group of 12, then, this church depended on this apostolic authority. So the big three, Peter, James, and John, become these ones that everybody looks to. They are the ones who have authority within the disciple community. You can see this in the way that the Gospels are written, which disciples are lifted up, and which ones we don't ever hear about, like Thaddeus. Well, what did he do? Well, we don't know. His name's mentioned once. He clearly was not one of the leaders of this group. So it had apostolic authority. This is going to come into play with the Apostle Paul. How does he fit in this structure? But Jerusalem was the center of the church, and they had held the authority. The first kinds of things, the thing that kind of brought this church to a close was the martyrdom of James the Just, was the first one, but also then the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD means the Jerusalem church is going to go away. However, it had already started to lose some of its authority, and I think I'll be able to show that. So the destruction of Jerusalem is the final blow to this Jerusalem church. The reason the Romans did that was finally they grew tired of, they had given all kinds of concessions to the Jews, allowing them to worship their own God and not worship the gods of the Romans. As long as the tax money kept coming in, everything was fine. But the Jews refused to live underneath that occupation. And so finally, I think his name was Jesus. It was another Jesus, maybe it was Barabbas even, who had a surname anyway. There was a rebellion. And once that rebellion happened, that was it. The Romans came in and in their typical efficiency, absolutely wiped them out. And that's when you hear about the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem. The Romans left that in place. They destroyed everything else. They left that in place to show how big the temple was that they knocked down. And then they sowed the ground with salt, and they made sure they cut down all the olive trees, and they banished all the Jews from Jerusalem. And then the campaign ended with that Masada event, where, okay, we can't get up there, we're going to build a ramp. You know, it'll take us a while, but we're going to do it. So sooner or later, the Romans, which then, the interesting thing again becomes that the Romans have all this power and all this might, and then this movement actually takes over the Roman Empire by the 4th century. The Antioch Church. This was started by those who fled after the stoning of Stephen. So the stoning of Stephen happens very early in the book of Acts. And it's prompted by the rivalries within these communities. So the Pharisees and the Sadducees thought that they had stamped out the Jesus movement by killing Jesus. But now the disciples are talking about like he's raised from life, and now this movement is really spreading. And they don't know what to do. We've got to figure out a way to stop this. You have that scene where Peter is brought before the Sanhedrin and challenged, never speak about this man's name again. And he says, you know, if I have to die, I will speak. I'm not going to listen to you. And so there's this kind of rejection then of those Jews that are following Jesus. That's where you read the text about a mother will betray daughter and a son will betray father. This was a family fight that's going on. Well, once that happened in Jerusalem, a whole bunch of Christians scattered. They left. Now you might think, we think about the plans that God has. You know, the church would not have spread without persecution. It was persecution that made it go where otherwise we wouldn't have gone. Otherwise we would have just stayed perhaps in Jerusalem. The beginning of this movement, they again only spoke to Jews. They went to the synagogues. They were connected to the Jewish people. They didn't have a mission to the Gentiles. But finally, Gentiles became included. Why? Because this is a time of great religious ferment. Everybody's interested in new things. There's all kinds of cults going on at this time that people are following. And this Jesus cult seems so outside and ordinary, it attracts people. And they're also attracted by the way that these Christians live. It has something to do with that communal life together. Their generosity, their absolute commitment to their beliefs, the kindness of these Christians, all those things that kind of attract Gentiles. Barnabas is the key leader of this Antioch church. And it's Barnabas, of course, that eventually will send Paul on his first missionary journey. So we hear about Paul, because Paul, as we're going to hear about in a minute, has gone off and started persecuting the Jews. He is known to this group to have been converted, and so Barnabas sends for him and gets Paul to go on his first missionary journey. This is the place they first called Christians, which is kind of remarkable that they didn't take on. Go ahead.
Where's Antioch?
Antioch's on the kind of on the coast of would be present day, what would it be, Lebanon? So up the coast from Israel, yeah, up to the north, right. The other thing that is unique about this period, unlike other periods of history, I mean, it's happened before, but this period in particular has this Pax Roma happening, this peace of Rome, because Rome dominates the whole region because they're very good at building cities and roads and commerce. There's an ability to travel throughout the Mediterranean world that was not there before. In fact, the roads were, some of the Roman roads, if you've ever gone to Rome or other places in Italy, even in England, if you go up to like the Hadrian's Wall, you can still see Roman roads that are still there. Maybe Texas could learn something from the Romans, right? Build it once and last 1,000 years. Appian Way is the main road coming to Rome. Yeah, exactly. So because of that, there was the ability to move about, and bandits were generally kept in check. So you had security on the roads as well. So people were traveling all over, and that meant this faith would spread very quickly. When we read things like in the book of Galatians, in the fullness of time, God sent the Son to be born of a woman, we think, well, if you're going to send a Messiah, this is the time to do it, if you're looking at that kind of first century. The Pauline Christians. So Paul understands himself to be sent to the Gentiles, which is actually kind of odd, given that he is a Pharisee of Pharisees, a Jew of the Jews, of the tribe of Benjamin. I mean, he's absolutely a fanatic when it comes to his Jewish faith. And then he's the one who basically gives it all up in order to reach out to Gentiles, which is really remarkable. His first mission, and of course the story you all know of Paul, and he wrote to Damascus when he went to persecute Christians. His missionary journeys happened between 47 and 57 AD. So 10 short years, this guy travels throughout the known world at that time, or at least the Mediterranean world, and starts all these churches. I mean, incredible energy, intellect. He is, if we looked at like a figure in history who's done more to change the human beings or the society, Paul's got to be right up there with anybody. So in some ways, we worship a Jesus of Paul's imagination rather than the Jesus of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Quite a different Jesus. So Paul even has the response, he shapes the entire Christian world based on these missionary journeys. He resists the authority of the Jerusalem church. Now this is the place where the thing finally breaks. And it depends on what you read. If you read in the book of Acts, it sounds like Paul goes to Jerusalem, it's chapter 16, in order to get permission from the leaders in Jerusalem to then go back to the Gentiles. So he goes and he tells them what he's doing, and the book of Acts has Jane and Peter stand up and say, he's doing a good ministry. We should encourage him to do it, but we should tell them, don't eat meat sacrificed to idols, don't engage in sexual immorality, which is worship, cult worship. So don't be engaged in the temple prostitutes and that kind of worship that's going on in the Gentile world, and contribute money to the poor. That's what it says in the book of Acts. In the book of Galatians, Paul says, in defense of his own ministry, I went to Jerusalem to those reputed to be pillars. He doesn't even give them credit for being disciples. Reputed to be pillars. I don't know if they're pillars or not. And he says, and they didn't tell me anything. I told them, I'm going to go to the Gentiles. And then they said, well, make sure you contribute to the poor, which I was anxious to do anyway.
What tradition did Barnabas come out of? Where did he fit it on?
Well, Barnabas gets in on the beginning. And remember, there's that missionary journey, in the first missionary journey, where John Mark goes back, leaves early. And Barnabas and Paul have a falling out based on that. Because of the second missionary journey, Barnabas wants to bring John Mark again, and Paul absolutely won't hear of it. Barnabas goes off his own way, and then Paul continues on. If you look at the kind of how this all is shaking out in history, we're looking at it really 10, 15 years. There's this ascendancy of Paul right to the top very quickly, partly because he has so much influence in the Gentile world. Not that he doesn't have trouble with the Gentile world, as we read from his letters. But the impact of the letters is probably the key thing, that we don't have letters from the other disciples, right? We have the letter of James, which is Jesus' brother, just the one short book. We have things that are said to be written by Peter, but they clearly represent a time when Peter's probably dead. And there are also, Peter's a fisherman, probably can't write. It's unlikely that he wrote the letters, but he probably influenced the letters, let's say that. But only 2 short letters. Paul has almost the entire New Testament, right? It's Pauline. And these letters have been preserved and passed on. I was talking with someone just this week, actually, one of our members, about biblical things. And Paul never considered that the letters he was writing to these churches would become the Bible, right? That's not what he was doing. He was writing to specific things. And he didn't think about the fact that, I wrote to the Corinthians, and I told them, okay, your women shouldn't speak in church. They should go, if they have a question, ask your husband at home. They should cover their heads. And all these rules, women in the Corinthian correspondence. When he talks to the Galatians, he says there's neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female, all are one in Christ Jesus. He has none of the prohibitions against women. So Paul isn't thinking, okay, I wrote that to the Corinthians, I should write the same thing to the Galatians. That doesn't even enter his mind. So I've got a problem with the Corinthians, and this is how I'm going to solve it. The women are causing trouble because they're being associated with the cult of ISIS. We don't want to be associated with those cults. So let's be different. Galatians, their problem is they're so focused on the law. I'm going to break it wide open and say the law is something that is like returning to your own vomit. Why are you going back to it? Who's bewitched you? So you see, even in his letters, he doesn't think about what he's written to each one. So no wonder Christianity is kind of a schizophrenic religion when it comes to, that's why we can support so many things, because the Bible was never written as a whole. It was written, even the letters written by the same person don't have consistency because they weren't written with that in mind. They were written for specific purposes.
Did he write multiple letters?
Oh yeah, there's a lot more that were lost. Yeah, there were tons.
I mean, he was following up with what he had visited there.
Yes, the way that the letters worked was that he would go to a city, he would go to this is according to the book of Acts, he would go to a city, he'd go to the synagogue, he'd start to teach out of the scriptures why Jesus is the Messiah. He would get rejected by the people there. Some would listen, some would not. He would leave the synagogue, set up in a house somewhere, with usually either a Gentile person or a devout Jew. And he would teach for a while and get this church established. Then he'd move on, and then he would send letters back to these churches as a way of kind of cementing what it was that they needed to do. And then the way that we get the letters is that some of them survived, and they were copied, and then they were passed on. And once the disciples died, we want to see this in a minute, then they said, well, these letters are important, we better hold on to these. The Romans, on the other hand, and the Jews knew that we need to destroy these letters. That's the Nazis burning the books, right? You burn the books, get rid of the knowledge, and everything will fine. Like that great movie, Days of Eli. Was it Eli?
The Book of Eli.
I didn't see it coming. He's beheaded in Rome, probably 62, 64. What's kind of fascinating when you think about Paul and what we don't have is that there's a good chance he made it all the way to Spain. He says when he writes the Romans, I'm going to pass through, I'm going to go to Spain, that his journeys are much larger than we actually imagine. His letter writing was prolific. The fact that we have these few letters is amazing, but he wrote tons of letters. He was writing all the time. Peter, he's got the prominent position in the Synoptic Gospels. So this is the interesting thing. While the Gospel writers give Peter all the credit, of course, Paul isn't part of the Gospels because he's not a Christian yet. But Peter is treated with prominence. Even in the book of Acts, where Paul slowly takes over from Peter, he's still seen. He's always listed first, except Galatians 2. Isn't that interesting? Why? There's a rivalry between Peter and Paul. So Paul doesn't even give him first place. And clearly Peter is the one that Jesus says, on this rock I'll build my church. Now we would say, as Lutherans, he's saying on the confession of Peter, when Peter says, you are the Christ. So we say, that's the rock, the confession. The Catholics say it's Peter himself, which is how you end up with the seat of Peter being Rome. He's one of three in Jerusalem. He has this rivalry with Paul. The last reference we have is in Acts 12. And so we think that he's probably crucified in Rome. Clement, so now these people that we'll be talking now are not disciples. These are later. Some of them may have been alive. For instance, Clement could have been alive when Jesus was resurrected, perhaps, or been alive at that, his possibility. He'd be alive early on in the Christian tradition. He might know disciples. These are what we call the church fathers, the ones of the second generation of leaders. So he is around 98 AD. He writes Ignatius of Antioch in 105. I do not command you as Peter and Paul did. Again, this is second generation of leaders. Irenaeus in the 2nd century, greatest of the ancient church, founded by Peter and Paul. So see what's happening. By the time you get into the 2nd and the 3rd century, Peter and Paul are listed together, even though Paul didn't know Jesus personally, never met Jesus, was not a disciple, was not called by Jesus to follow. He got in after the fact. And the way that Paul talks about Jesus is very different from the way that the Gospels talk about Jesus. But anyway, by this time, they're recognizing that Paul also has preeminence. Persecution of the church. It began in Jerusalem. We saw with the stoning of Stephen, and later on the beheading of James. It was localized. It was Jews against Jews because they were trying to stamp out this religion that threatened the whole faith. Now, you think about, I don't know that they think about this anymore, but you think about the Jewish faith back in the first century, back in Jesus' time, or before that. And what their kind of whole understanding of God is if we do what's right, if we stay pure, if we don't intermarry, if we make sure we sacrifice correctly, everything's fine. If we mess up at any level, God will squash us like a bug. You know? So that's the way they understand it. So any kind of heresy is not just dangerous to the individual, it's dangerous to the whole nation. In fact, we have that captured in the Gospels where Caiaphas says, or Annas says, he's the high priest that year, he says, it's in the Gospel of John, it's better for one man to die than the whole nation perish. So they even had this understanding the Romans would be the hand of God. The reason the Assyrians, the Babylonians came and conquered us is because we were unfaithful. So there's a real desire to keep the faith pure, and they're going to stamp it out. But it is a localized persecution. We have this idea that they're being persecuted all over the world. That actually didn't even happen in the Roman time. It was always somewhat localized. In the beginning, as I said, it was instigated by Jews. There was an economic motivation once you moved out into the Pauline area. So we have the example of the Temple of Artemis in Ephesus, where everybody stops buying the little statues because Paul's been so successful in converting them. And now all the makers of the statues of Diana call out a mob. Now often Peter's or Paul's experience was that they were prominent Jewish women, prominent Jewish leaders that would incite a mob. And they would use whatever method possible to get the mob to turn on Paul and his people. Eventually there is Roman persecution, and that also has somewhat of an economic reason for it, and because the Romans absolutely can't tolerate fanatics. So even if you're a good person, if you're a fanatic, we have to kill you. They recognize that there's nothing more dangerous than a fanatic. And the worst fanatic is a religious fanatic, because they don't care. They'll do whatever, and they don't. You can't hurt them. You just have to kill them. That's the only solution you have. The first persecution, as I said, was the stoning of Stephen in 34 and 35. It was focused in Jerusalem. It meant that the followers scattered. Very interesting when Jesus says at the ascension, "You'll be my witnesses in Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria and the ends of the earth." But after he said that, what did they do? They stayed in Jerusalem. They didn't move until the persecution happened. And then, oh yeah, we better get going. And now they go out to the known world. Saul is sent to Damascus, so he's part of that to arrest those who belonged to the Way, which was the name of Christians prior to them being called Christians. They were followers of the Way, or they were followers of the Galilean. Those were the kinds of terms. In Acts 12, we have the persecution of leaders. That's where, again, Peter is arrested. King Herod in 41-4 put James to death with a sword. We have Peter arrested. James brought the loaded stone in 62 by order of the Sanhedrin. So what we have here is they're doing everything they can to stamp it out. And they think, we've got to get rid of the leaders, but it's too late by that time. It's already spread, and it will continue to do so. And persecution actually doesn't stamp it out, it actually causes it to spread even more. Opposition to Paul, we have this captured in the book of Acts. If you read the book of Acts and see how they're each of these little towns. Now, all these towns are in Galatia, which is predominantly Jewish character of these cities, and these are devout Jews, and they object to Peter or Paul talking about Jesus. So that they incite riots in all these places. In Philippi, Paul and Silas are jailed. That's the great story about the Philippian jailer. And then it turns out he's a Roman citizen, and the Philippian jailer is saved. Thessalonica, we have Jason who's arrested, and people call out Jason has brought foreigners into our city. Thessalonica, now you've crossed over into Greece. Philippi is in Greece as well. So Galatia, Asia Minor, or Turkey right now, Turkey. And then you cross over into Greece where these other cities are. Okay, now the first big kind of move was Claudius in Rome in 49 AD. Since the Jews constantly make disturbances at the instigation of Christ, he expelled them from Rome. Tacitus is writing much later. He's the Roman historian. But the reason that they were sent out, the Jews and the Christians are battling it out, and that's causing disturbances in Rome, and so he gets rid of all of them. that comes into play when you read the book of Romans. Right? The idea of the book of Romans is that there's controversy, there's a conflict between Jews and Christians. And the reason is because the Jews had all been expelled from Rome, and then the Gentiles were in the church and taking over the church and started to worship and do everything. And now the Jews were able to come back like 10 years later. And now they want to be a part of that church again, but somebody's sitting in their pew. And it's like, hey, you're in my pew. No, you've been gone 10 years. This is my pew now. And then there's all this fighting about who's the leader and what's the nature of it. And this is now a Gentile faith. It's not Jewish. How can I be a Jew and still be a Christian? So there was all this controversy, which is why the book of Romans begins with the chapter 1, verse 19, and into the end of the first chapter, dealing with the Gentiles who had traded the truth of God for a lie. And then chapter 2, up to about 3:19, talks about the Jews and how they also followed after something that was false, believing that they could be perfect according to the law. And then you get to that last verse, 3:21, 22, and 23, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. So Paul says, no, we're all together. And the whole purpose of the book of Romans is to try to put these two groups back together. And it's because of this that the groups got separated. First great persecution is under Nero Caesar in 64 AD. We think that this is probably the person that's being referred to in the book of Revelation, because Nero Caesar, in Latin, can be put into numbers, and Nero Caesar equals 666. And anybody who has a mind can figure it out. That's what the book says. That's what it's pointing to. From the Roman historian Suetonius, men followed a new and malicious superstition. So that's how they describe the Christian faith. A new and malicious superstition. Tacitus, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on the class hated for their abominations, called Christians. So they were hated for their abominations, which was the way that they worshipped, that they refused to worship the emperor, that they didn't want to be part of society in the same way that everybody else was. They didn't like to go to parties. They just were not fun. They were. Oh yeah, Nero was. Yeah. Nero. The story about Nero and his mother. He eventually did kill her, but the one that I like was, and I think it is in Tacitus, where he constructs a ship, and the ship is designed to fall apart in the middle of the ocean. And everything works according to plan, but then his mother swims back to shore. And said, I can't believe you're here, Mom. All right. What happened? Oh, no. So, eventually he does go. And then the report is the burning of Rome. So he attaches the blame for the burning of the city on the Christians. Palestinian Christians, now this is where so they are prominent in Galatia. They're a very different group of Christians. And something I find most fascinating. If you've been in my class on the book of Revelation, they are the ones who had been dispersed to Asia Minor after 70 AD. When Jerusalem had been destroyed, they went to the place that made sense to go to. It was close by. The Jewish communities in Galatia were focused, even the Christians there were focused on following the Jewish law. When you read the book of Galatians with that in mind, he says, why have you returned to who has bewitched you? Especially things like circumcision and all the cultic practices and following the festivals and the new moons and the kosher diets. So the Galatian Christians were Jewish in their practice, but they followed Christ. That's who wrote Revelation. And if you read Revelation with an eye to that, none of the Gentile Christians are going to be included in the 144,000. None of us get in because we're not Jews. Even the way that one of the key clues is those who say they're Jews but aren't. That is, those who claim to be followers but aren't. Because why? They don't get circumcised. They eat meat sacrificed to idols. They, hang out in the Roman baths. They're not one of us. And so this group of Palestinian Christians, severely persecuted, not just from the Romans, but also cast out from the other Christians. There's no way to put together the kind of nature of the faith according to Revelation, and then the book of Ephesians, right? Ephesians is saved by grace, lest anyone should boast. Book of Revelation, those who overcome will, if you follow all the rules, if you are pure, you will be saved. Completely different take. So you've got two different churches going on at the same time in the same area. I'm not going to say what that would, maybe in our day and age, it would be one church that is more focused on particular things that you have to do, and the other church more open to grace.
I thought the author was the guy on the aisle, was John.
The only way to resolve that, so you have in the Bible, you have the Gospel of John, you have, Patmos. That is the person who wrote it.
But he came out of the
He came out of this group, exactly. But it's not John, the disciple of Jesus. And the reason is, maybe it is, the trouble is, that you can't have John writing all three things that are attributed to John in the New Testament. And the reason is the Gospel of John is the highest form of Greek there is. It's beautiful in its phrasing, and it's clearly a person who is Greek in their understanding. They think like Greeks. The Book of Revelation is completely the opposite. It's called Hebraic Greek, and so he has a phrase like he wants to say that the angels were playing on their harps. He has angels harping on their harps. He doesn't know Greek. He's like it'd be like me trying to speak Spanish, right? I've got a little thing, I don't know how to, I don't know conjunctions, I don't know how to do the verb tenses. I just am going to use that word. It looks okay to me. So you can't have the same person writing it. And then the letters of John are John the Presbyter, and again, completely different vocabulary, different author. So what we think, I think what most scholars would say, is that this writer, John, is not the disciple, is a member of this community, a leader in this community of Palestinian Jews, whereas the Gospel of John probably is purported to be the disciple. These are Orthodox Jews who believe Jesus is the Messiah, so they continue to be Orthodox. And they have this apocalyptic vision of the end of the world, which is captured in Revelation. All right, now we move beyond. So all the disciples now are dead, and the church has got to figure out what to do with that, because Jesus was supposed to come back, and he didn't. So what do? Were we wrong, or is there something else going on? So they start to try and collect all the stories. They write them down. The Gospels are written sometime after, either just before the destruction of Jerusalem or right after.